All right, this is the video lecture for the first lecture of Unit 5, and this is Manifest Destiny. We're going to start with the causes of manifest destiny. We have a pretty significantly growing population east of the Mississippi River. A lot of the best land had started to be taken up by this point in the early 1830s and 1840s, and so we're going to really see, if we kind of take a look at the time period of manifest destiny, we're really talking probably between 1830 and 1860 is the time period where it really has a lot of settlers going to the west. We're talking probably about 300,000 people east of the Mississippi River locating west of the Mississippi River. And so, we have a growing population during this time. You've got the market economy, the market revolution. The population's growing. It's getting a little more crowded. And a lot of people wanted to move west where there is an abundance of land. People wanted to move for a number of different reasons. The first one being to farm. But others grew because as populations moved west, they needed services, merchants, traders, every kind of service you can possibly think of that would be needed out in the west. So those are the reasons why people were kind of coming to the west. Now, in terms of our government, we have a group of people that we would kind of call expansionists. And they see it as our divine providence, like God has ordained that we are going to cover ourselves over the North American continent and maybe beyond. But, as our past success in fending ourselves off from the British, what we believe is our superior right to the land over Native Americans, over the Spanish / soon to be Mexico, that it was our right and our God-given ability to move out of the west, to claim more land, to farm on, to exploit it for resources, to all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to get trading ports in California, what would be Oregon and Washington. And then, Southern people, there were a lot of people that were saying, well, maybe we can move more land to the west to grow cotton and increase slavery. So a number of reasons why expansionists would want to move population out to the west. And then there's also kind of an ethnocentrist attitude, and that is that our culture was just better. Like the way we did things was better. Our religion was better. Our economic system was better. And we were better suited to spread ourselves out over the continent. And these other people, they either needed to assimilate or they needed to leave because we were just claiming it as ours. And so that's kind of an awful part of manifest destiny, but certainly a big part of the cause of it. All right, so in 1840, we have the election of William Henry Harrison, but he dies almost immediately. He only makes about 40 days. And his vice president, this is the first time that a president has ever died in office, his vice president, John Tyler, is called a Whig, but he's barely a Whig. He, in an earlier time, he would have been a Jeffersonian Republican. The only reason he was put on William Henry Harrison's ticket was to get Southern support for very much a Northern candidate. And so, when he comes as a president, the only thing that's Whig about him is his name, because really he's very Jeffersonian, and he's a strict constructionist. He's a states' rights guy. He is against the very fabric of the American system, much to Henry Clay's chagrin. And so here you have Henry Clay, who's basically trying to run the Whigs, but John Tyler, who's the president, he is doing everything counter to this. And so, he vetoes internal improvements. He does not want anything that resembles the American system. All right, so that's kind of his domestic stuff that you need to know. In terms of foreign policy, there's two things about the John Tyler presidency from 1840 to 1844 that I think you should know. One of them is the issue of Texas. Now, Texas at this time, they have declared their independence, and they want to become part of the United States. Now, this is a sticky issue for the United States because Northerners don't want this, because they know that there's cotton being grown in Texas and there's slaves in Texas, and Texas will become a slave state. The Southerners, they realize too that this will upset the North, and so even though they may want Texas to come into the Union, they are kind of coy about it. And so Andrew Jackson, he doesn't allow this to happen when he's president. Van Buren does not either. And then as soon as Tyler comes in, he actually wants it to happen, but it doesn't end up happening until one of his last days in office. So we're going to put the issue of Texas on the back burner, and then we'll talk about this more in a little bit. All right, the other major foreign policy, accomplishment, I guess you could say, is done more by the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, where he solidifies the border between us and Britain. Things had kind of, tensions were a little bit high between us and the British. They had a role in allowing slaves on the ship Creole to, they were supposed to go from one port in America to another. They end up, the slaves on the ship, kind of like in the Amistad case that we talked about earlier. They seized the ship, they mutinied, they went down to the Caribbean, and then the British basically set them free, and that kind of upset us. And so we have that going on at the same time that there are disputes over our northern boundary between us and Great Britain. And luckily, neither country really wanted war, and so they worked out the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And I think all you need to know about that, as you can see on the map, it really kind of defines our northern border between us and Great Britain from around the Great Lakes all the way up through Maine. Okay. All right, the election of 1844. I think the biggest thing you need to know about the election of 1844 is it is a mandate for expansionism. It is a mandate for Manifest Destiny. The Henry Clay, that he tried to get elected again as for the Whigs, but he was going to fail once again. The guy we need to focus on is James K. Polk for the Democrats. Now, James K. Polk you can kind of think of him as a young Hickory. He's a young Andrew Jackson. In terms of how they interpret the Constitution, in terms of kind of what they think, you want to think about him in terms of Andrew Jackson. He's probably a little more states' rights than Andrew Jackson, but he had kind of the same constitutional scruples, as they say. All right, so in terms of his platform, he wanted lower tariffs. He's a Southerner, so he's against high tariffs. He's against the Bank of the United States and instead wanted to recreate the independent treasury, where the bank would then store their funds from taxes and tariffs in there, and not having a Bank of the United States that had stockholders and foreign investors and things like that. Okay, but probably more than anything, he was an ardent expansionist. He made kind of little effort to conceal the fact that he wanted to annex Texas. He wanted to get California as well. And then you can see on there 54-40 fight. This has to go with, if you guys would go up to the map that I see on the right there with Alaska and British North America, you could see that line of latitude 54-40. And so by this time, we're starting to get some commercial disputes happening between us and Great Britain. There are many kind of war hawks, expansionists that wanted to take all of that area in the kind of the red shaded area for Oregon. And so really James K. Polk was somebody that was willing to fight for that, to that end. And so again, James K. Polk, when we think of him, we need to think of him as an ardent expansionist. Right now, go ahead and take a look at the election results. You can see that pretty much everybody in the West, most of the countries in the South, you have a few people in the middle, and of course New England that votes for Henry Clay and the Whigs. But for the most part, the election of 1844 is a mandate saying we are okay with expansionism and let's go forward with it. And so that's what happens. Now, as expansionist occurs, we need to make sure we understand that there are still natives in the West. By the time, before I get to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, by the time that Manifest Destiny is starting to unfold, we still have probably 300,000, at least 250,000 Native Americans. We've got over 200 different tribes. We've got people, very diverse. You've got the Plains Indians who depend on the buffalo, the horse. They're very much nomadic hunters. Then you have people that are agriculturalists and fishermen in the Northwest, people that are living off abundant game and doing quite well. And then in the Southwest, you have the Pueblos who have very little water. They try to gather themselves around streams and rivers the best they can. They are agriculturalists. They're very peaceful. And so you really have a diverse group of Native Americans that occupy the West that Americans are going to assume tumble onto. All right, the first kind of legislation that we have, and it's going to foreshadow our relations with Native Americans, is the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. I don't believe that this is on your key terms, but I think it's important because it kind of sets the tone and sets precedent for how we're going to deal with Native Americans in the future. So the Treaty of Fort Laramie essentially creates a reservation system. Here are where Americans are going to be. The Native Americans, you are best to go in this area and kind of stay there. And the Americans take the best land, and the worst lands are left for the natives. And so that's really what was decided in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and that we're going to have subsequent treaties that do the same thing in the future. All right, we must also understand that Spain still has a presence, although it's probably more of a nominal presence. They still do have a presence in Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, but especially California and Texas. Okay, so let's start with California first. Remember that Spain had occupied the area that we now call California, and they did so by setting up a number of missions that they were going to use to try to convert Native Americans into Catholics. Right next to the missions, or sometimes literally within the walls of the missions, they had a presidio. And so the Spanish had placed Spanish soldiers that were there to protect the Spanish missions, the churches. And then they used this in almost, I don't want to call it an encomienda system, but they used their military force, the ability to conscript Native Americans, to try to get them to at least, somewhat forcibly to convert over to Catholicism, to work the land as farmers. And, they had set these missions up about a day's walk apart. So you have everything from Santa Barbara, San Diego, San Francisco, all the way up and down the coast, going up from what we would call today northern Mexico. Now, they don't have a ton of people there, and that's kind of the problem for Spain. You're talking about none of these places have probably more than 10, 15,000 people at most. Most of them have only a couple hundred or a couple thousand. And the problem with that is then as Americans move into this area to farm, to trade, to create services, they're going to just overwhelm the pure numbers of anybody that's Spanish or the Native Americans. And they're just kind of, in a way, just kind of shove and force those people out. Now, Santa Fe is another, it's another Spanish fort, but there's not a lot of people there. Probably less than about 5,000 people. When Spain leaves and Mexico comes in, the Mexicans are going to open up trade. But right now, while Spain is in control of Santa Fe, they ban any kind of trade with the United States, and it's a very northern outpost, way up north in the desert, and there's just not a lot of people that are that live there. Now, once Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. That kind of allows America's presence to start coming to both California and to Santa Fe. Now, Mexico, they did kind of encourage this. For example, with Santa Fe, they did start trading with Missouri and other places in the United States. And so that's going to lead to a lot of Americans coming in just through trade. And so this starts out as a good thing for Mexico, but pretty soon Americans are going to be overpopulating both California and Mexico in Santa Fe, and that's going to cause a problem for Mexico. Now, as early as 1845, James K. Polk had one of his, one of the people that worked for him in Congress, John Slidell, to go out to California to contact the Mexican government and offered to pay $25 million to buy California. He is rebuffed, and it's very clear that the United States wants to get California. The Mexicans start to realize this, and this kind of starts to begin the tension between Mexico and the United States. as we'll see as the Mexican-American War is going to start here pretty soon. All right, now as for the people going for the overland trails. So you can see here, if you take a look at the map, you can see that typically people would come over as families, at least until the gold rushes. Once you start getting the mineral rushes, then it's mostly people coming over as single men. But I want you to understand that when people use the overland trails to go to Oregon or California or into Utah, for the most part, they're coming over as families. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the Conestoga Wagon Trail. Usually you try to, get a large group. You would have your possessions in your wagon. Most of the people walked quite a bit. Some of the small children may have ridden, the women, or if somebody was sick or something like that. But for the most part, you either rode on a horse or you walked quite a bit. You traveled about 15 miles a day. There were kind of areas that people that had services or small little outposts where people could water their horses, their cows, or a lot of times they'd bring their cattle with them or their sheep, and they would let them pasture out during a day. Now, for the most part, Native Americans were pretty nice to these people. There were actually very few instances where the Native Americans hurt the pioneers. In fact, a lot of times they helped them quite a bit, and that's kind of a misguided myth in American history. Probably there are a few more attacks from people going from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, but in terms of the Oregon Trail, which was the main line that people went on, you didn't have a lot of Native American attacks. All right, so the main trails you need to know the Santa Fe Trail. This was not as much of a settling trail as it was a trade trail. Beaver furs, guns, manufactured goods. These were things going back and forth between Santa Fe and Independence, Missouri. The Mormon Trail, we talked about, this is where families that came from, Nauvoo, Illinois, went to go settle in the desert. But the main one for settling is the Oregon Trail. So I want you guys to find Independence, Missouri, and follow the Oregon Trail. And it's going to end over in Oregon into this area that's called the Willamette Valley. And the Willamette Valley is very notorious for having great soils. It's well watered. There's mountains kind of on either side of it that bring water into it. This is where most of the settlers during the Manifest Destiny area were heading to. And that was because there's an abundant amount of land and there was a great amount of farming to be had. All right, and then other settlers like the Donner Party you may want to read about in your book. A lot of these people were coming to California to go to the Sacramento Valley. If you've ever been to the Sacramento Valley, it's kind of between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. This would also be a good place for farming. John Sutter had set up Sutter's Fort in the Sacramento Valley, and people were trying to claim land around there. So these were the main trails that people were using. Might be good to kind of go over the key term that has to do with these trails. Okay, California. So I talked about Sutter's Fort. I talked about the Spanish mission. So let me get to the gold rush. So remember that up until this point, and really other than the gold rush, a lot of the people that were coming to California, they were coming as families. But then the gold rush brought a whole new wave of people coming in, mostly young single males. They were coming into the area between Sutter's Fort in Sacramento and San Francisco. And so in the kind of the mountainous area right outside of Sacramento in the Sierra Nevadas, you're going to get this area that they find gold. And so that creates these boom towns, and thousands upon thousands of miners come in between the 1840s and probably late 50s to find gold in California. And it single-handedly is going to make the population of California go up. A lot of these boom towns they're pretty lawless. There's not a lot of women and children. What women are there as services. So they could be doing laundry. They could be prostitutes. They could be doing a lot of different things that are services. But other than that, not a lot of women. And so mostly it's young single males. It causes a lot of vigilante law. there's a lot of murders. It's a very dangerous place to live. And so this is one of the reasons why eventually the United States wants to lay claim to it. They can create a territorial legislature, start creating real law and order, and bring some stability to California. Now I have on there the 59ers in Nevada and California. This is not related to California, but also gold rush. This is how Colorado in particular starts to get their population. Nevada the same way too. Nevada is more of a silver in the Comstock load of silver. And then in Colorado, we have kind of both gold and silver. Gold in the Pikes Peak area, gold around Cripple Creek, up by Black Hawk in today what we would call Golden, Colorado, is where they'd kind of take off from and head up into the mountains. And so we had kind of the same issues early on with our gold rushes. Okay, talked about the Slidell offer. If I haven't for some reason, remember this is where John Slidell tried to buy California. But since the Mexican government refused this, and because we have so many Americans pouring into both California, and we're going to see that in Texas as well, this is going to cause trouble between America and Mexico. All right, so I think this is where I will end here today, and this is where I will start in class next time. So we'll start in Texas and talk about Texas independence and the war with Mexico. Have a good day.